committed to naming a black woman as your vice presidential running mate?
I am not committed to naming any but the people I've named, and among them there are 4 black women.
So we actually asked 3 different questions around Joe Biden's upcoming vice presidential pick. One question looked at the attributes that were most important for different types of voters, and specifically Democrats, Independents, and Republicans, for Biden's vice presidential pick. And that's important because fundamentally you have 3 different audiences when picking a vice presidential candidate, and the goal is to excite Democrats and your base to go out and vote, make sure that independents are excited and you're able to pull them, especially in the last stage of the campaign, and ideally you want someone who's not too controversial as a pick so that disaffected Republicans also could possibly vote for it. And so we started by looking at attributes. Then we looked at the lift that each of these attributes would give by asking a question of, does such a person or such a profile of a candidate make you more or less likely to vote? And the third question is, we actually asked some specific names for registered voters to respond to, and we also have a view of which names within the party would give Biden the lift that he's looking for in terms of his vice presidential pick. So fairly comprehensive view, and an interesting view as well. Reflecting the challenges of the moment with the coronavirus pandemic and also the economic situation that we are facing, the key attributes for voters in a vice presidential pick, and I mean voters at large, were experience, someone that has previous government experience. 60% of registered voters wanted someone with previous government experience. And secondly, the other element that played quite strongly was for someone to be a woman and economically progressive. And 47% of all voters said that they prefer Biden to pick a woman in terms of attributes, and roughly 4 in 10 voters said that someone who is economically progressive as well. When looking at Democrats and independents specifically, you see that picking a woman with experience for Democrats are the 2 top attributes. Roughly 67 and 68% respectively would like to see those 2 attributes in Biden's vice presidential pick. When looking at independents, what really popped up was experience. 60% of independents wanted a candidate of experience. Second attribute was someone who was economically progressive at 45%. And the third attribute was someone, a pick who is a woman. So a fairly consistent picture, and that's why we asked the second question, which was about lift. What attribute would give the most lift to Biden, and what is most important to communicate to registered voters, the Democratic base, and independents specifically as part of the vice presidential pick. And the picture is remarkably consistent. The attribute that provides the most lift is picking someone with previous government experience. So billionaires are out and safe hands in government are in terms of voters' choices. It was followed by someone who's economically progressive that gave the second most lift amongst Democrats and independents. And picking a woman, especially a minority woman, provides excitement to the Democratic base, but it's less important to independents as an attribute and will provide less lift to Biden. In addition to the other questions that we ran on Joe Biden's possible vice president pick, we also asked the question simply with the women candidates that are rumored to be on the short list. And Biden himself has indicated that his preference is to pick a woman vice presidential candidate. The findings are remarkably consistent. Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren play very well with the Democratic base, and they energize the Democratic base. For both of them, they curry roughly 22 to 23% of the Democratic base support, whereas Rice has less of a following within the Democratic base. However, Rice brings to the table an edge with independents that Harris and Warren don't have, at least at the same level.
The challenge is that there have been lots of polls that have been done in different ways over the last few months that have asked voters varying degrees of this question. Does having a woman make a difference to you? Does having a woman of color make a difference in terms of the way you're voting? I think in this particular cycle, it's a really complicated question to get good insight on for a bunch of reasons. One is that we have a deeply polarized electorate who are voting for one or the other no matter what, right? The Democrats are deeply with Biden. They're not crossing over the other way. Core Republican voters are mostly still deeply with Trump, and they're not crossing over. Where it gets interesting is with independents, and it certainly gets interesting with moderate Republicans. There's a lot of indication that certainly among moderate Republican women, particularly those in the suburbs, that they're defecting from the Republican Party in pretty high numbers. So there's already such hardcore lines drawn in the sand. You know, it's a weird cycle to then be trying to layer on top of that how big of a difference the VP pick makes. In this instance, I think that it will make a bigger difference than even the polls are indicating with some key voters that get overlooked. First of all, we have about 12% of the electorate that is a solidly swing vote, meaning that they have been consistently inconsistent, right? Those people have an outsized influence in the battleground states. And among those, the women particularly are going to have an enormously outsized role to play. So if we were to go deeper on that segment, I do think that the vice presidential pick makes a bigger and bigger difference. In a race where you have these very closely divided questions, it can tip people one way or the other. But ultimately, in any incumbent presidential election, it's a referendum on the sitting president. And as long as voters are really making that decision, I think more even than just that core decision of who they're voting for on the other side. I think we see similar things in this question of whether or not the female vice president. We've had female VP candidates before, obviously Sarah Palin, and back to Geraldine Ferraro, and this is not the first time we've seen this, but it's the first time in a very long time. And certainly we've never had a woman of color running in that vice presidential slot. So I think it's very hard to predict. I think ultimately this election is going to turn on two things. It's going to turn on the security and safety of Americans in relation to both COVID and what's happening with the economy. And it's going to turn on female voter participation, period. Black female turnout, white female suburban turnout. And then actually one of the stories that I think has been a little underappreciated or overlooked is going to be the role that Latino women are going to play. We're very concerned that 20% of them in the polls that All In Together did said that they are not going to vote. And we think one of the reasons for that is because they are so incredibly burdened by the COVID crisis, disproportionately have lost their jobs, disproportionately suffering economically, disproportionately suffering in terms of the burdens of care. And I think that is going to continue to be a factor in this race. But the women have outvoted men in every election since 1980. The huge reason why Donald Trump won in 2016 were those non-college educated white women who voted for him. There is some indication from our polling and from others that those women are beginning to swing left, are beginning to swing towards Biden. That, I think that is going to turn largely on how the president manages or doesn't the COVID crisis in the coming months. But at the end of the day, it's going to be women that decide this election, this and every time.